Our second talk of the session is using Frappé,
Yep.
using Clang to visualize large code bases by Nathan Hawes and Ben Barham from Oracle, who come all the way from Brisbane.
Great, so thanks very much. Yeah, so as you just said, today we'll be telling you a little bit about our code comprehension tool called Frappé that's designed for really large code bases. I'm Nathan, and this is Ben. Yeah, and so this is just to say that what we're doing is a research project. We've been working on it for about the past 2-ish years with the two of us and one other guy that's in here. So just for a bit of context. So what exactly do we mean when we say this is a code comprehension tool? It's just about understanding your code. So what are the various parts are of your system, how they all fit together, what your code is doing, what your system is doing. And when you think about that, well, documentation is great if you have it. Oftentimes it's out of sync or just missing or exactly the opposite of what your code is doing sometimes. So if you want to know what's really going on, you have to look to the source code. But the problem then is, what do you do if your source code is really large? Like if your software has 1,000 lines or tens of thousands of lines, generally you can get through that okay and get your head around what's going on. If you're looking at a code base in the order of 10 million lines of code, that's a pretty big task to sort of get a bigger picture of what's happening there. And if you think about it, if you're looking at your code, your typical editor has about 50 lines of the screen at any one time. And that's sort of that tiny dot in the middle there if this is your 10 million line system. So you've got this really narrow window into this really massive system. And what's more, like while you're looking at those 50 lines, typically you'll want to know, you'll come across some function calls or some types, and you have no idea what they are. So you have to then navigate in that space to find out where those things are located, to see their definition, find out more information about them. And you have to do that transitively. So you go to one function definition, and it has references to other things and so on. So, So there's a range of IDEs answer these types of queries reasonably well. So they have features like go to definition, find usages, and so on that help with this navigation in this space. And they have a couple that sort of pull you back a little bit to a slightly higher level, so things like class overviews, type hierarchies, and so on. But what we found is that when we're looking internally at Oracle at least, when we're looking at these really massive large C and C++ code bases, there's a number of problems getting IDEs set up and working for those kinds of systems. And there's a couple of issues there, but key among them is imprecise language recognition. So often IDEs have their own custom parsers that don't match the actual compiler that you're using. So the IDE will complain about a bunch of things that the compiler's fine with, and vice versa. But there's also quite a few issues with the custom build systems of these really large systems. So typically they've been in development over sometimes decades, right? So they have their own build systems. And if the IDE is going to give you anything intelligible about all these dependencies, it needs to be able to hook into that to know what's going on. So there's a lot of effort to get these things up and running and working. So what we find in practice is that with these kinds of systems, most people are using basic text editors and text search tools. So they'll use Vim and Emacs to look at their code, coupled with tools like grep, sed, or cscope, which is sort of text-based indexer. So these are fast and simple, but they have a number of issues, primarily in precision. So they know nothing about symbol type, scoping information, which files actually get linked together, or the preprocessor. So they're not handled very well. So what we mean by imprecision, using this example on the right here, if you're looking at a particular reference to a field ID, you want to know what exactly that is. If you do a lookup using something like cscope, you might get 20 results, but obviously there's only really one solution. So you sort of have to filter through these results. But the other issue these tools have that IDEs also mostly share is that we've got this same low-level focus. You're viewing this tiny little portion of your code, and while they do have a couple of features that lift it up slightly, you still don't get an overall impression of the entire system. So with Frappé, we're aiming to, first of all, provide precise dependency information so we can do that code navigation correctly without giving all these extraneous results, but not at the cost of build integration. So we want to make it easy to deploy this thing in existing systems. We also want to allow users to specify the high-level queries directly. So while you go to definition, find references, and so on are good, you're usually trying to achieve some high-level purpose. You might be trying to find out how an invalid value got to this point in the code, so you're sort of following back up to see where it might have come from, or something like that. And finally, we do want to show that users the broader context of the system. So while they're navigating around the code, keeping track of where exactly they are, and just give a general picture of what the overall system is about. So as a quick overview of how Frappé works, we take the source code. From that, we extract precise dependency information, which we store in a dependency graph. We let users query that graph, and we also use the data in the graph to display, to visualize the code so people can understand the overall structure of the system a little better. So I'll now hand over to Ben to tell us a little bit more about how this all actually works.
Cool. Awesome. Ooh, yep. Okay, so thanks, Nathan. So I just wanted to start off first with why we decided to use a graph format in the first place. And I suppose since Kythe is doing relatively the same thing, I guess it's a good idea. But we felt that it was just a natural representation of your code. So we're used to dealing with core graphs and your type hierarchies and your control flow graphs and data flow graphs and things like that. So in our graph, your nodes are basically just your entities in your code base. And then the edges are just the relationships between them. So for your nodes, we have kind of similar ones as Kythe, except we don't really differentiate between semantic and syntactic nodes. So we just have things like functions and your types and your files and your directories and your modules and so on. And then your edges are just the relationships between those. So you have your function calls your function. You have your fields contained in your types. You have macros expanded in your files or your functions and so on and so forth. And so with that graph, we can then just phrase all those kind of high-level queries that Nathan was talking about as graph queries. So just as a quick example of that, we have this really small little graph here. And let's say we're in the definition of main. And in main, we see some write to a field buff, and we might want to know more information about buff. So to do that, we can just follow the outgoing edge from main to buff, and we find the definition. And conversely, if we were, say, at the definition of buff, and we wanted to know where it was used, we can just follow its references or its incoming edges out and get all the things it's used in. And as well as that, we can also do a little bit more complicated queries. So we could do something like an impact estimation. So let's say we're at some macro definition first, and maybe we're going to make some change to it, and we would like to know, what code am I going to affect? What things might I have to change? So with that, we can just follow the expansion edges to the function first, and also another macro prev. And from there, we also might not want to know what things does prev get expanded into, and we can again follow those edges into insert and pop. So that's kind of the graph and what we do with it in some small little examples. But how do we actually get that, and then how do we use it? So the first step is extracting those dependencies from the source code. So to do that, as Nathan said, we really want to keep a simple build integration. So we don't want the users to have to do any extra steps. We just want it to work, essentially. So we are using compiler wrappers, which were built in a previous project within our group. And these compiler wrappers do two things. One, they just pass the arguments that your normal build command has just straight through to the native compiler. So you get your regular objects or your modules or executables. As well as that, it translates those arguments into some Clang equivalent arguments and then runs Clang. And in Clang, we've built a plugin, a lot like Kythe, and to output all our dependencies. So to explain that plugin a little more, not too much, because Kythe just had a big, long talk on it. So essentially, we use PP callbacks as well, and that just lets us get all the macros and the expansions and interrogations and so on and so forth. And then we also use the recursive AST visitor, and that just lets us visit all the declarations and the types and the expressions and to get all this data. And basically all I want to say about it is that it's really awesome. As Luke said, Clang keeps track of all the locations you could ever want, the spelling locations and expansion locations, and even the presumed locations if you so desire to change what file your code is in. So once we have that data, which is output into some files, just like intermediate files, we then just import that into a web server with a graph database backend. And from there, we expose a bunch of interfaces. So we have some editor plugins for Vim and Emacs, which kind of do your normal code navigation things that you'd expect, so find definitions and find references. And we also have some CLI scripts, which just kind of exposes a scriptable interface to that graph. And then we also have a web UI. And this web UI is kind of our solution to taking the results of those queries and then showing them in the broader context of the system. So now I'll just pass over back to Nathan to talk a bit more about that visualization.
So thanks, Ben. So as Ben was saying, like, the web UI is really where we're hoping to give people a broader sense of what's going on in their system and handle some of these higher-level queries that can give lots and lots of results, where you don't want to just dump text at the user. So the basic idea of this visualization that we're using, called Codemaps, is to employ a cartographic map metaphor. So the core idea is sort of, if you think about the world map, mapping the sort of continent, country, state, city hierarchy that people are used to the equivalent in code. So from your high-level architectural components being the continents, down through to the individual files and functions as you zoom in. So the reason we're using this metaphor is that we believe like the distinctive shapes and positions on a map serve as visual landmarks. So you sort of have this perceptual understanding of where things are without having to think about it too much. So looking at the map, most people can immediately just spot Italy thanks to its boot-like shape, or Antarctica because it's in the south, and so on. So it's encoding the location information about where something is into a visual representation. So if you think about when we're talking about locations of things in the code, this is usually a long string of a file path, maybe coupled with a line number or something like that. So it takes a little while. If you have hundreds of results that are giving you location information, it takes you quite a while to pass through and process where all these things are actually happening. So we're hoping that with this representation, that location sense sort of becomes more intuitive. And the real benefit to that, if you have it, is that you can then overlay quite a variety of information, and it gives you this context of quite quickly of where everything's happening. So if you think about something like search results, if you imagine this is your code, when you search for some particular function or so on, and if you get lots and lots of results, if you're seeing this on the map, you might know that the thing that I care about is in Australia, so I can just zoom in on that set of results and immediately eliminate all the rest without having to go through them. Or conversely, if I'm already zoomed in on the particular part of the code map that I care about, I can just show results from that area rather than giving you the entire set. It also helps for things like paths through the code. So we've all seen stack traces that can get quite long. Again, here you sort of have to parse through these textual paths to see what parts of the code are actually involved. Whereas if you overlay this on top of the map, you can see more immediately that either this is like incredibly localized, so it's just in one particular subcomponent, or it's crossing through my entire system everywhere. And looking at the example on the right, you can imagine if there's a crash happening here in my code, which is this middle region, I can see that it started over in someone else's code at point function A, come through my code out into some library, and then come back and crashed in mine. So I might have a better idea of who to blame. The other one, obviously, is just code metrics in general, and a range of granularities. Because we have this hierarchy from these high-level continents down to the individual functions and fields and so on, you can overlay metrics at any of those granularities. So if you have something at the, like maybe your test coverage is line-based, you could imagine that picture on the left showing you a heat map style of how good your coverage is in various parts of your code base. Or you can aggregate metrics up to a higher level. So if you're dealing with countries, for example, you might say these are the bug counts per particular units that your management cares about, or something like that. So you can overlay those metrics at different granularities. So the big question then is, how do you create this kind of geography for code? Because there's no intuitive representation that exists. So quickly, just the idea of using a map kind of metaphor for code isn't new. So we've got software terrain maps on the left there, and software cartography, which is another approach on the right. So the difference between what we're doing and what's here is that we're working with multiple levels of abstraction. Whereas these two visualizations, the one on the left is purely function-based, so each little green region you can see is one function. And on the right-hand side, it's class-based. So we want to be able to see all levels of granularity in our maps. So the way that we're doing these generating these code maps is using both an abstraction hierarchy, which is how we form these different abstraction levels from our source files. So it groups the source files into those higher-level concepts. And by default, we just use the directory structure because that's sort of one that's there intuitively. And we also use a lot of the dependency information that we're storing in this graph. So this is the dependencies between files. So if there's calls between functions or writes to global variables and so on, that corresponds to an edge between files and how strong that edge is. So it passes through 4 stages. So the first one is a force-directed graph layout. So this tries to position all the files based on both the dependencies between files. So it tries to position things that are closely, have a lot of dependencies between them close together, and also on that abstraction hierarchy. So if 2 things have a common parent in the abstraction hierarchy, you also want to position them nearby. And there's a trade-off parameter between them that you can set. So I can say just follow the dependencies, so put everything that's closely related in clusters, or just follow the abstraction hierarchy, so just put stuff together that's in a particular directory together. So this positions our files in a 2D plane, and we size them based on their line count. So the areas of these circles here are representative of some metric that you prefer, but by default, line count. So from there, we have our nodes positioned. The next step is implicit surface generation. So this is where we sort of trace our continents around sets of files that are positioned within a threshold distance of each other. So this gives us our continents there, and there's a certain number of files in each landmass. The next step is surface subdivision. So we've got our continent shape. We now need to divide it into a region for each individual file. So the way we do that is with a Voronoi diagram, but it's basically just dividing the dead space between the nodes evenly between them, so that the areas of the final regions are still representative of the metric we use to size the nodes. And from that point, we then go through a recursive subdivision process. So we've got our file level and a shape for that. We then want to divide that area down to show the functions, structs, fields, and so on inside. So the layout process works top-down. And the reason it works top-down is so that we can take into account the position of the parent nodes when we're positioning the next level of directories below that, as well as taking into account the dependencies across ways. And that goes all the way down to the file level to position the nodes. And the recursive subdivision is happening from that area down. And these are the 2 approaches we're using to do the graph layout and to do the recursive subdivision. So it's an approach. The subdivision is with an approach called Voronoi tree maps. So the easiest way to sort of get a feel for what this actually does and looks like is to give a demonstration. So I'll now jump across to that, if I can. Cool. So here we have Linux, actually, as a code map. So each of these sort of shapes here, right, are the landmasses, the continents we were talking about. And in this case, I've got the trade-off between the dependencies and the directory structure at about 90% going towards the abstraction hierarchy. So it's pretty close to the directory structure in this case, with a little bit of influence from the dependencies. So from this sort of higher-level view, if we start to zoom in, we can start to see a few more directory names pop in. And if we keep going down, we can then start to see the files contained in each of these islands. And as we go further down, we then start to see the functions, structs, macros, and so on inside of them. So we can click on any of these to see a little bit more information about it. So you can see what file it's in, its line count, and the containing files there as well. If you click on them, we have all these linked back to the source code as well. So here's the definition of this particular function, and you can scroll through the source there. So this is a nice way just to quickly sort of jump around the code and click on things and see how everything's working, or get an idea for what everything is. So we have a basic search, so we can search for things like we can search for symbols, we can search for files, so source files or object files too, because we do have the information from the linker there. So if we search for main, you can see 2 results, and we overlay them on the code map here. So I don't know how well that shows on the projector, but just down the bottom right here, there's 2 results there. Or if we don't know something, we have basic wildcard support. So if you do something like anything with lock in the name. And at the moment, we're searching for everything. So this is fields, enumerators, and so on. But you can narrow it down and say just include functions or just include fields, or so on, if that's what you care about. So if we look at a particular example that I have here, so we can search for our result. If we double-click these results, or if we've clicked on the map, we can also double-click these. We can then see the immediate dependencies associated with that overlaid on the map from our graph. So we're sitting on our node for the function fu_text_lock_pi, and we're seeing all the edges coming out of that. So thanks to all the nice information we get from Clang, we can also have source locations for both sides of the edge, basically. So we have our function definition for that on the left, coupled with the call site on the right there. And we sort of have this stuff, all the incoming dependencies we show first, so you can see everywhere this thing's being used. Then we sort of step through the actual function line by line. So just quickly, like the ones that look kind of faded out are the ones that aren't present on the map. So on the map, we're not drawing the local variables, the parameters and stuff. We're just drawing, things at the sort of global scope, or high level scope. And we have macro support and so on. So you can sort of step through those results. But I mean, typically, we're hoping that the map just gives you a more general overview of those dependencies. So you can see we've got a couple going down here to this island, and I can sort of look at what this is, and it's everything in sort of arc x86. I'm assuming it's the architecture-specific part of the kernel here. We saw the kernel label around that part. So I mean, Linux headers here, net, and so on. So if we see, we've got two dependencies here going down to this arc, and we want to know what it is, we can also just quickly filter these. So if we type arc, we can just show those particular dependencies and see what they actually are in the code here. So there's a few macro expansions and calls, and these calls are actually coming because of the macros. So Clang lets us see through what's happening inside those macros. And similarly, you can filter on anything here. So if you just care about the rights to any fields or global variables or so on, you can filter them to whatever you like. So we also let you go beyond just the direct dependencies. This is sort of similar to the SViz tool we saw a little earlier at the lightning talks. So not the things with this call chains feature, if I click that, we can see not just the things I'm calling directly, but the functions that those functions call, and so on transitively up to some level of depth. So I mean, we've just got 5 levels of depth here, but we can up that to whatever we like, basically. And then we start to see a little more red on the map there. So the intention with this is that it sort of gives you a general overview of everything this could eventually then call down into. And using the location information, that's where we can sort of start to pull something more interesting out of it rather than just throwing you all this text of these are all the things that it's eventually calling. So for example, if this function was something to do with memory management, and I notice there's some red over in my SQL parser or something like that, you notice that probably shouldn't be happening, and you might want to know why that's the case. So we also do just explain to the user how these things might be happening. So with any of these sort of red regions here, if I zoom in, I can right-click on it to see the path of how that's actually, the shortest path of how that's actually being reached at the moment. But we have the info to do as many paths as you like, basically. So you can sort of see how that's possible. And we list each of the calls in the sequence down the right, and you can click on those again to see the source preview of how that's actually happening. So I mean, we also have information from the preprocessor. So another use case that uses exactly the same kind of display, if you have a particular file, so here we can see it's being compiled into a particular object file. It's contained in a directory and all the includes here. But again, these are the direct includes. So you might want to know the whole set of all the header files that this thing eventually includes. So similar idea to call chains is include chains. So the same kind of thing. You can see the full set of the includes this thing eventually pulls in to this translation unit. And we think there's lots of other queries that you could benefit from this same type of display. The basic idea is anything that gives you tons of results. If you present them visually, you can sort of help the user to filter out the parts that they actually care about. But you still want to be able to tell them also why that each of these things are happening, because that's the next question, right? Sorry, history here is just what you searched for previously. It's not anything to do with the source code repository or anything like that. It's just whatever you've clicked previously. Yeah. So the other thing, we'll leave dependencies there for now. But the other thing we also do is the metric overlays. So at the moment, we don't have a lot of data in here. We've just got line count, which isn't the most interesting of metrics to look at. But you can sort of imagine this being something like your test coverage or your profiling data to see where your bottlenecks are. So if we turn line count on, I don't know how well that's showing up, but if we zoom in a little bit, we're sort of coloring everything on this gradient, where you can choose the colors, where green is sort of your good, functions that have a good size of some number that you specify. So let's say we're happy with anything that's 200 lines of code or less, up to some maximum of 500. So you can change these thresholds to just see the ones that are more the outliers. So if you have some enforced thing for code quality that your function shouldn't be bigger than X number, you can do that. Though if you did that, you'd probably just want to set them both the same, so you just get a binary partition between the two metrics. So we want to do a lot more with this metrics work. And everything we're doing is based on static information. So we'd also like to incorporate dynamic information, not just as metric overlays, but also to help in with code comprehension, like what are the common paths through the code. So I mean, if this was a database, for example, you might want to know, if I run a query, like what parts of the code are getting exercised. So we'd like to incorporate that information into these maps as well to help people understand what's going on. So that's it for the demo. Jump back in to the slides. So in terms of where we're hoping to go with this, we want to have a more detailed dependency graph. So for things like finding the references to something, in these really large code bases, things get called from tons and tons of places. So you're still seeing this big list of calls, even if you're precise. So you want to be able to let them be more specific about that. So find calls where the third argument is some particular flag, because oftentimes your functions use that sort of thing to define their behavior. Also things like find all functions that the function pointer could point to, because you may have calls that are through function pointers. At the moment, we don't do that. So we want to support that kind of stuff too. As I was mentioning, more overlays. And also store multiple versions. So here, everything you're seeing is just one snapshot of the code. When you're dealing with code changing over time, we'd like to be able to do something with impact estimation of a change set. So if you've actually changed the code, showing which parts have been added, removed between the two versions, and also the effects of those, so you can sort of help at code review time. The other major point there is code map evolution and stability. If you've got your map in your one version of the code, and in the next version of the code, everything's completely different, having this sort of perceptual location and understanding of where everything is that you learn over time is useless, because your world map's just completely changed overnight. So the algorithms we're using are incremental. So we think we can keep it stable, but at the moment we're not enforcing it. So everything, the graph layout and everything is all based on its current position, move the nodes to some better location defined by some function. And so we can sort of control and pick up the layout where we left it the night before, with adding in our new nodes and removing them and hoping everything adjusts. Yeah, and that's for the graph layout side of it. For the Vorona tree map side, that's also inherently stable. So just to sort of give a rough idea of that, I just have a little video showing how these things handle updates, because it's pretty cool, I think. I hope you like it. Make it, oh yeah, full screen. Oh, don't know why the controls are over there, but yeah. So this is just showing how this thing can update live and react to changes. So you can see we're introducing a file or a function into our map. It might be growing, so people are adding code to it, and how everything sort of smoothly adjusts around that. Yeah. So it's kind of hypnotic watching this stuff. So I just wanted to show you. But eventually, we would like to get to a point where we can sort of show you how the code map changes over time. So maybe continents are sort of drifting together if you're adding dependencies between them, or pulling apart if you're starting to modularize them. We'd like you to be able to see that happening. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, that's sort of the rest of the demo is more of the same. So that's mostly it for our presentation. So thanks very much.
So when you've used this internally at Oracle and used it with people who actually know their code, do you have any surprising stories from that about what they've seen, what they've found the most useful, what they found less useful that you can tell us?
Right. So internally, we've initially just the Vim and Emacs plugin, because we have this precise data behind the scenes. They love that. So we've seen that from a few people internally. For the code maps, when we showed them, we've sort of only got one group to kind of verify it, because it's mostly following the directory structure, right? It's sort of what they expect it to be already. When you show them something that completely ignores the directory structure and just has the dependency information, no one likes it, right? It's not how that system is meant to be. So I mean, in terms of the layout, That's sort of why we've gone mostly with the directory structure with just a slight influence from dependencies, because the reaction when they see, like, the sort of, it's not necessarily truthful, because what we're doing is a rough approximation for how things are coupled, and it's not really, we would like to make this something that does give you a better idea of the overall architecture, but we're not confident calling it, an architecture recovery tool at this sort of point in time. Yeah. Does that kind of answer? Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
So sorry, I came in a bit late. But first of all, this seems like a really cool tool. Is this ever going to be available for us to use?
At this point, we have no idea really. It's internal only at this point. So
Okay, cool.
Maybe in the
I'm
future.
taking note of your research
it's
director's.
research,
I'm taking note of your research director's email address there.
This is Christina. This is Christina.
And so, anyway, have you guys read or heard about a book by Colin Ware called Visual Thinking for Design?
No.
Okay. You should. It's a pretty short book.
Cool.
You should definitely read it if
Yep.
you're doing this kind of visualization stuff. Basically, what it talks about, and it's kind of the big idea when doing information visualization is the brain's visual system has a set of independent channels, essentially, that in parallel process what you're seeing.
Right.
And so essentially, when you're doing this kind of information visualization, you're matching, okay, what kind of data do we want? So your big idea is you want to use that hardware in your brain to figure out stuff, infer patterns or whatever.
Right.
And so really what you're doing when you're doing information visualization is you're trying to match up aspects of your data to the particular channels. And so this book, Visual Thinking for Design, it's kind of a really easy, quick start to actually know. It's like, okay, well, the brain is really good at telling particular kinds of colors apart, or it's good at knowing different shapes, or the alignment of different shapes, or blurry versus sharp edges, or whatever. And so, like some of these things you could, like as for really complex data sets like software projects, you can really pack in a lot of dimensionality of the data in an unobtrusive way by matching in aspects of the data set to each of those channels. And you can get maybe 10 different aspects of the data set in one visualization without having it be overbearing by doing this. So that might be something to look into.
Yeah. So at the moment, we've really only got two, and the size of the regions represents something, and the color represents something. But we would like to basically let you correlate as many different types of data as possible, because sometimes there are interesting matchups between certain types of data. Yeah, so I'll grab that book off you, the title and author after the talk, if that's all right.
Hi, I have two questions. One, when you used it internally, what kind of productivity improvements did you see, if at all?
Okay, so we haven't done a really big study on this. It's really just been so far giving it to individual developers to have a go at, and we've gotten good feedback from them. But there's no sort of number I can give you, and productivity is quite hard to measure anyway.
Your own personal productivity, have you seen it gone up?
Sorry?
Have you seen your own personal productivity grow up?
We can't actually, because most of this is written in Java, and we're only supporting C++ currently. Okay. Apart from the Clang, the actual plugin.
All right. My second question is, just the drawing library, is it some other code, or is it internal to Oracle?
So we're just using Java AWT to draw. It's like tile-based rendering on the server side, and there's a bit of JavaScript to draw those tiles onto a HTML5 canvas on the web browser.
Okay, all right. Thanks very much.
Nothing fancy. Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much.
Cool, thank you.